You think you're safe in your home, scrolling on your phone, with the doors locked and the lights on? You think the rustle of leaves outside is just the wind, and the creak of the floorboards is just the house settling. You're wrong. The world is full of wrong turns, dark corners, and moments where reality peels back to show you the grinning abyss underneath. The stories you're about to hear aren't fiction. They're warnings. They're the hushed confessions of people who saw something they were never meant to see. And now, neither of us will ever be the same. So turn down the lights if you dare, lean in closer, and listen. Because what you're about to hear might just save your life. Or it might be the last thing you ever hear. I had a very strange babysitting experience the other night. Everything was normal until the kids were in bed. One of the kids kept running around, but finally they were down. And so I was just scrolling through random videos on Instagram to pass the time. I was watching one and I heard something. It was like a man, or one of the boys pretending to have a deep voice, was upstairs. It just said no or something like that in this weird, gravelly voice. I was confused and a little spooked, but I brushed it off and sat on the couch to watch a movie. Their dog was walking around and growling at the windows that led to the backyard. That creeped me out too, but I tried to brush that off. I thought maybe the dog had seen a squirrel or something. At this point, it's about 10 p.m. The dog was laying on my lap and started growling and barking toward the kitchen. At this point, I was like, you better cut that out, because who on earth wouldn't be creeped out by that? Later, I heard these incredibly light, whispery voices like children. I wasn't completely sure if it was just the kids waking up and making noises, but it only lasted a moment. After I noticed, I didn't even have time to go up and check. I noticed all these weird things, but I didn't really put them all together until later that night. I talked to my mom, and she told me that my sister and her friend had babysat there as well, and they both had odd experiences. Bad vibes, the kid telling her she'd seen some things, and the kids actually addressing something that wasn't there. My mom didn't tell me before I went over so that I wouldn't be spooked, which I guess was good because I got an independent witness of whatever happened without being influenced by the experiences of others. Anyway, I'll still go back to babysit. I'll just be prepared to throw hands with Casper if I have to, I guess. I've been backpacking and camping, mostly solo, as an adult for the majority of my life. I'm cautious about my surroundings, and I listen carefully when I'm out. I try to remain an observer and move through the land with little impact. I'm also very interested in the mysterious and obscure, cryptids, alternate realities, and the unexplained. I've read most of the missing 411 cases and am a serious devotee of true crime. All of the morbid and curious things I can find, anything strange that will fire the imagination. There have been occasions where I have felt slightly uncomfortable or watched, even when I've been out in the woods, but mostly I've chalked it up to being alone and alert. Maybe my inherent skepticism makes me less susceptible to encounters which others experience. I look for logical conclusions first. I've never encountered any truly off or deranged people out in the forests, but I do consider that the biggest threat is the human animal. A few years ago, I set out to camp near an old-growth forest in North Georgia. Most old growth here is gone, but there are places that haven't been logged, and if you get the chance to visit one, wherever you may live, I would suggest it. It's beautiful, serene, and alive in a way that's hard to describe. This particular forest was one of hemlock and poplar, and the trees were massive. I had a guidebook that gave directions out into the sticks, following little country roads that eventually turned into gravel. After a long drive into a national forest, I parked near the trail, which was unmaintained, meaning it wasn't very popular or highly traveled. I hiked out through the woods to where the trail eventually just kind of stopped. There was very little undergrowth. I spent the afternoon just exploring, looking at the trees and enjoying the calm. I eventually made my way down to a creek and crossed over it to an old field that formed a sort of bowl in the land, with hills and ridges on all sides. The fact that there was a field meant that there had, I guess, at one point been people living in the area, but I saw nothing of the sort when I was there, and my map showed that I should have been far from any roads or settlements. I set up my tent and made some food. It was late when I decided to have a little smoke and lay out in the field in front of my tent and look at the stars before bed. There was little to no light pollution, and I always relished the opportunity to enjoy the sky at times like those. As I was laying there, I began hearing a loud knocking sound from up near the ridge where I'd been earlier in the day, maybe 1,000 yards away. 3 knocks and a long pause, followed by 3 more, and then it would repeat. When I say knocks, what I mean is a very loud noise, like two logs or trees being hit together, loud enough to reverberate in the little bowl that I was in, loud enough that you could almost feel it. I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but it was night in the forest, and anyone who's been out there knows that it is dark. I thought it had to be a person making the noise, because what else would make such a rhythmic sound? It was extremely loud, and it would have taken considerable effort to produce. I had seen nobody else at all during the day, and the direction from which the sound came was in the section of old growth that I had explored earlier. And that's it. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I went to bed, feeling like I had heard something I wasn't meant to hear, or maybe that I'd heard something specifically meant for me, and me alone, to hear. I packed up and hiked out the next day. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't hyper-aware and waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. I've told friends about this, and they'll either say it was for sure a Sasquatch or that I was for sure close to someone's house that I just didn't know about. But why would a person be out in the woods late at night banging logs together in the dark? In May 2009, I had just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto, and we were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping and fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Lots of lush forests, farmers' fields, some small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing now that it was probably trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting the breeze, and drinking some quality craft beer. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight and we shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched, yipping type of noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening, and then I started playing on my phone again. The noise was really annoying. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise had woken him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare it off, no BB gun or anything. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot. Hopefully that would scare it off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me. He babbled, "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and I scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies, so I'm an easy target. But I've never seen somebody, especially him, look that scared. And I never want to see that expression on anybody's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on. And in retrospect, it really didn't sound like a coyote. But I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyway, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap to make sure he wasn't crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing and I felt like crap, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust. And that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful, though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew that there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. I mean, mostly because he was making high-pitched yips at strangers in tents in the middle of the night. I pulled my head back inside the tent, and my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to just swear at the guy. My buddy started yelling obscenities, saying to go away and we're trying to sleep in here, but with more obscenities. The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running toward the tent. They stopped right outside of it, but we didn't waste any time. We started yelling again. "We have cell phones in here! If you don't go away, we're gonna call the cops!" With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving toward the road. Needless to say, we lay awake, petrified, until the first sign of sunlight, and then we hightailed it out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely wasn't normal for either of us. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much, we never really talked about it since. But either way, it was wild. I live alone unless you want to include my cat, and then I live with a cat. I have a house with an attic conversion, but since it's just me, it's basically an empty room. I think the previous tenant had used it as a bedroom. Obviously, when I first moved in, I did go up there just to have a snoop around. There are 2 light switches for the room. One at the bottom of the stairs and one that is a long string that you pull, which is right in the middle of the room. There's a door at the top of the stairs that I always keep shut. I close every door behind me. An open door really bugs me. After living in this house for about 3 months, I noticed that the door was open and the light was on. I could see the light on the wall opposite the door. No big deal, I thought. I obviously forgot to shut the door and turn off the light, so I go and do that. About 2 weeks on, I arrive home from work. It's early January and it's dark out. I can see the window to the room from outside and I can see that the light is on. My first thought is, I've been robbed. I barge into my home, quickly sweep the first 2 floors, expecting to find someone. But there's no one there. They must still be up there, I thought. So I fly up the stairs and the door is shut, but the light is still on. I swing the door open and nothing. I will say that I'm very skeptical about stories when I hear a feeling of dread or felt I was being watched, but I had both of those. I had this horrific feeling that I really wasn't alone up there, but it's a simple, empty box of a room. I try my best to shrug it off. I turn the light off and I shut the door. I've been living there nearly 7 months now, and since that day, I get the same feeling when I walk past the stairs to the attic, day or night. The light is on at least twice a week, but now it switches itself off after a while. Recently, I've started hearing very loud bumps coming from the attic, which is right above my bedroom. The first time I heard it, I naturally assumed that somebody was trying to get in through the attic window, so I ran up there. But nothing. Lastly, my cat, who is very tiny and during the night stays downstairs, refuses to go up there and has actually done the whole arched back, hissing thing at the door. It could be because he's just out of sorts, but given the situation and the fact that he never hisses at anything ever, it really freaks me out. I've had a few experiences throughout my life, but this one tends to stand out. I was about 14 and had been babysitting for a few couples for about 3 years already. 2 of the couples were close friends, and I would end up babysitting for both sets of their children. One had 2 and one had 3 children, ranging from 18 months to 10 years old. This particular night, I asked a friend of mine to assist, so I do have a witness. The home we were in was an older, beautiful 2-story home with a full basement in a nice part of Tulsa around Swan Lake. The kids got rowdy when bedtime was mentioned, which is why I had my friend. They were in an upstairs room, the baby's room, jumping and laughing. And all of a sudden, we heard 3 incredibly loud bangs from near the window on the 2nd floor. Upon hearing this, I called out and told the kids that that was enough, having thought that it was one of them. It was then that I noticed that they were all frozen in their tracks, looking from the window to us. And one of them finally said, "We didn't do it." No one had been by the window. It wasn't until a few years ago that I would mention this part when I told the story, because I really didn't want to believe what I saw when I looked out. But there were 2 red eyes looking into the room from outside. I grabbed the baby, and we nearly ran over each other getting out of the room and downstairs. My friend and I ran into the kitchen and grabbed steak knives. We were young and panicked, and we huddled in the living room. First, we heard a loud crash. Then we heard something with loud, heavy steps just pacing back and forth. The home had original hardwood floors, so it creaked. I had called my parents, who were about 10 minutes away, no cell phones then, and told them that there was someone in the house. My parents came and my dad went upstairs. My friend and I closed behind, of course. There was no one. But the weird thing we did notice was that the bedroom door to the right of the top of the stairs was open. We went in, and the closet door was open, and there was a curtain which was down, which had covered a very small window, about 18 by 12 inches, and that window was open. There were no trees, no ladders, no gables, no way to access this backside of the house upstairs, especially through that window. When the parents came home, we had told them what happened, and I proceeded to mention that I probably would not be comfortable babysitting there again. The next morning, my mom mentioned that she had heard about a 15-year-old boy who had lived with his stepmother. He had hung himself in that house, but she didn't want to tell me because she didn't want me to be scared or imagine things. Thanks, Mom. Having heard this, it made me remember being in this house during previous times that I had babysat and other situations that occurred. I was looking at one of the graves sometime later when my boyfriend shook my shoulder and pointed at one of the largest graves a few meters into the distance. I'm terrible at knowing what people are pointing at, but this time I spotted it right away. It was a little girl. I would guess around 11 or 12 years old. She had very dark brown or black hair that looked well cared for and quite long. She was sitting on top of the grave with her legs dangling over the edge. At first, I saw her wearing a lacy white dress, like a nightgown that a rich girl would wear. It looked old, but I'm no expert, so I couldn't tell you how old. Maybe early 1900s. But I looked away to look at my boyfriend, and when I looked back, she was wearing a different dress. All I remember is that it was red because at this point, I was super scared. Something about the whole situation just felt wrong to me. I felt extremely fearful. And due to the fact that ghosts were very normal for me, this was extremely unusual. I had never felt unsafe seeing a ghost before. It was around this time that I noticed that the cemetery was eerily quiet. No sounds of bats, and there are lots of fruit bats in the area, no other animals. The air itself felt stale and stagnant. We just stood and stared at the little girl for what felt like an eternity, strangely transfixed. And then we both ran for it, up the path at full speed. I turned for a second to see if she was still there, but she was gone completely, and that made me run faster. Honestly, the whole run out, we were both dead silent. When we were back at the car, we sat there for ages, trying to work out what we had just experienced and seen, trying to rationalize it. But as we've both had paranormal experiences before, we knew it had to be a ghost. For a few months afterward, I continuously felt like I was being watched. I had frequent nightmares about seeing the little girl in our apartment. I always felt uneasy. We eventually moved around 30 minutes away, and the feelings and dreams stopped. I have since tried to research the ghost but haven't turned anything up, though there is a local ghost tour at that cemetery. Maybe the guide might know something. Ever since then, my paranormal experiences have been more frequent and have been getting more unsettling and disturbing. My boyfriend has been experiencing more things too. I'm not really sure what happened there, but nothing's quite been the same since. When I was about 13, I was staying with a friend in the Colorado Rockies, the foothills, in January. While we were at his buddy's house, I walked to get food from a nearby gas station on a small, windy country road. A car took a turn too fast, skidded on the ice, and rolled over in my direction. I was lucky that there were woods right to the side, and the dense trees saved me from the vehicle. As I ran away, I looked back, and I could only see his arm dangling limply out of the broken driver's side window. I was scared, and I still get shivers about it today. I think the person ended up dying just minutes later from the injuries. But for 3 days after that, I had strange dreams. They were very short, just small details. The feeling of grass, the moon, and a name. I only remember the last name now, Alton. On the 4th night, I had gone to bed early in an effort to get some sleep. I ended up drifting off at about 10 p.m. According to my friend's family, I heard a noise and woke up. But when I opened my eyes, I was laying right in front of a grave with the name Alton on it. It was a small village cemetery surrounded by pine trees. I would say it was less than 900 square feet. Despite it being mid-January in the mountains, there was no snow past the gate and in the cemetery. I was very cold, though, and scared. I managed to locate a fire watch tower where they drove me back to my friend's house. This was no dream. I woke up in a cemetery and got taken back home. According to them, they went to check on how I was doing at about 1 a.m., and I wasn't in bed. Their home security said that I had left their back porch at 12:40 in the morning. When the park rangers picked me up, it was almost 3 a.m. I explained my story to my friends and family, and they told me that there was no cemetery behind their house. I told them what the area looked like, and they said that they had a clearing like that, but it didn't have any graves. They offered to take a look if I would lead them, but I was too shaken. I also remember there being a small gate in this fence, but before I went back home, that gate was gone, and it was just a solid fence. I don't know what happened, but I'd really love some answers because it's been bugging me recently, so I decided to share my story. When I was about 12 years old, my family and I moved into a semi-detached house just up the street from our previous home. The house wasn't very big, and the floor plans for our part of the house were completely different from our neighbors. Our neighbors were a lovely little family of 4. The husband is from England, the wife from Norway, which is where I live. They also had a little 3-year-old girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. Now, I love children. I always have. And at that time, I really wanted to start babysitting. It's quite common to start babysitting at age 12 here, and I was turning 13 a month later anyway, so I wanted to find some small jobs. As we got to know our neighbors over the first few months of living there, my parents told the neighbors that if they ever needed a sitter, it would be nice if they would consider trying me out, seeing as it would be my first job as a babysitter. We thought it would be smart to start with the next-door neighbors, seeing as my parents would literally be on the other side of the wall if anything happened. Cut to a Friday night when my neighbors went to a party that was happening just down our street. I got there at about 8 p.m., and the parents told me that they would be home between 2 and 3 a.m. Both kids were already asleep, so they told me to just put on a movie and relax. Now, these kids were the easiest kids to babysit ever. Once you put them to bed and they fell asleep, absolutely nothing would wake them up. They are some of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen, so babysitting them was usually pretty uneventful. I was on the couch watching Avatar in the living room on the 2nd floor. The kids had their own separate bedroom that was just downstairs where the front door was. I could basically see their bedrooms from where I was sitting, as the place was quite small. Because of the hallway, I couldn't see the front door. The house was pretty small, so as long as the TV wasn't on too loudly, I could hear everything that was happening downstairs. At about midnight, I heard the front door unlock, and my neighbors walked in whilst talking. I heard them close the door, and they started taking off their jackets and shoes. I thought it was a little weird that they hadn't called to let me know that they were coming home early, but I assumed it must have just slipped their minds. So I went downstairs to greet them. I could hear them talking up until the point that I came around the corner in the hallway that led to the door. There was nobody there. The talking fell silent the second I turned the corner. The only sound was from the TV upstairs. My heart started beating so fast and my head was rushing. I ran to the bedrooms and checked the kids before I searched the rest of the house. I opened every door and checked every cabinet for anything that could have explained what just happened. But there was nothing. The kids were sound asleep. Eventually, I convinced myself that I was imagining things. I checked on the kids one last time just to make sure, and their doors were wide open so that I could see them from upstairs. I sat down to finish the movie while trying to process what had just happened. But when I sat down, I noticed that the TV had been shut off, even though I had left it on. When I turned it back on, there was just snow on the screen, and for the life of me, I couldn't get it to work again. That's when the talking downstairs started up again. Not only that, but this time the baby started screaming bloody murder. This baby never woke up from naps and definitely wouldn't ever scream the way that it did that night. I have never in my life run down a staircase as fast as I did that night. I rushed toward the baby's bedroom only to find the door closed. I ripped open the door and picked up the baby and rushed to pick up his sister. I took them both upstairs and held those kids for almost 3 hours before the parents came back home. The talking and sounds from downstairs came and went as I had the kids with me on the couch. I held them as close to me as I could and tried my best to keep them asleep. As the parents came home, I was too scared to walk downstairs to greet them. I couldn't be sure if it was actually them or not until they walked up the stairs and found me clutching their children. Obviously, they noticed I was upset and asked me what had happened. I honestly felt like I had lost my mind at that point, but I told them the story anyway. After I was finished, they told me that it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Apparently, they hear the voices all the time at night. I was kind of surprised that they didn't even think to warn me ahead of time. They said they were sorry that this had happened to me, and the mom walked me home to my house. I slept with the lights on in my room for almost a month after that. Believe it or not, I did go back and I did babysit those kids again. And every once in a while, I would hear the sounds from downstairs. Even though this happened a long time ago, my memory of this event is very crisp. I remember it extremely vividly just because of how odd and traumatic it was. A couple of years ago, my family, which consisted of my dad, my mom, my little brother, my uncle and aunt, and their 2 children, as well as my other uncle and his wife, were at church on a Sunday afternoon. It was just a regular Sunday mass, not anything special. What I remember happening was that all of a sudden, we left in the middle of the service. We were walking out and going to the parking lot, and I remember that my aunt was hysterical. She was crying and hugging my dad. My dad was almost in tears as well. I was around 7 at the time, so I was really just puzzled and confused, but eventually I forgot about it and went on with my day. Years pass, and the topic comes up at a family gathering. What really happened that day still creeps me out, and how my family just talks about it now as if it wasn't such a weird thing to have experienced is totally beyond me. Anyway, on that Sunday, my family was leaning on one of the walls of the building, facing the priest who was giving a lecture. It was really busy that day, and there weren't any seats left. About 30 minutes into Mass, my aunt notices a guy who looks almost identical to my deceased uncle in the crowd. She is stunned and elbows my dad to show him what she's looking at. The man she was pointing at was fortunate enough to have gotten a seat, and he was in one of the rows on a bench, just sitting there. As my dad is staring at this guy, he's puzzled and in complete shock. The guy looks up at my dad, makes eye contact and smiles, and then he just looks back at the priest who's giving the lecture. My dad freaks out, and so does my aunt, who noticed that the guy was an exact copy of my deceased uncle. The guy all of a sudden gets up, excuses himself from the people that he has to cross in front of in order to get out, and walks out an exit. As soon as he does, my other uncle walks on after him in an attempt to catch up and apologize for creeping him out. My uncle claims he followed him up to the exit, where he turned a corner and completely lost him out of sight. Now, that's already weird, but my uncle also claims that he noticed a scar on the man's left forearm that he knew for a fact my deceased uncle had. It happened in a firework accident when he was little. Ever since then, they never saw the guy again. Some family members of ours have claimed that they've seen somebody who looks exactly like my dead uncle, but who knows if it's the same guy they saw that day. Maybe it was just some random dude, or maybe it was my uncle's last attempt at saying goodbye to his siblings. Who really knows? Either way, it's a story I'll never forget. Every summer, my family takes a trip to Minnesota to camp out and fish for a week. This includes my aunts, uncles, and cousins. The experience I'm about to share with you took place on Blanche Lake, on a dirt road. It's an unlit dirt road surrounded by wetland and forest on each side. One night, my cousins and I stayed up extra late at the campfire and decided to walk down the road to the highway, which we often do, but never this late. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and 4 of the 6 of us decided to take the walk down the road, while myself and my cousin Nick decided to stay back and chill by the fire. After about 10 minutes, we both got this creepy feeling, like something was watching us at the fire. We decided to take the walk ourselves and meet up with our other cousins at the end of the road or on their way back. It was a clear night, and we could see every star in the sky, but it was very dark since the moon was but a sliver. We only made it about 1,000 feet down the road when something white became visible in the middle of the road up ahead. We began to jog toward it while hollering, "Hey guys, wait up!" thinking it was our other cousins. We got within about 10 feet when we both came to a screeching halt. It was so dark we still couldn't fully make out what we were looking at. But it appeared to be a woman with long white hair wearing a white nightgown. She was just standing there, not moving or saying anything. My cousin and I both said, "Hello, are you okay?" but got no response. Neither of us wanted to get any closer, and we slowly backed away down the road from where we'd come until the woman was no longer visible. We got back to the campfire and waited for our 4 cousins to return. Once they got back, we asked them if they had seen anything strange or seen anybody on the road on the way back down. They said that they hadn't. We told them what we had encountered, and the remaining time that we spent by the fire that night just felt like something was still watching us. This is a real experience that happened to me when I was around 10, camping with my family at a provincial park in Newfoundland, Canada in the mid-1980s. In Newfoundland, there's a lot of traditional folklore about fairies and of being fairy-led. It's sort of like being mesmerized and stolen away by the fairies. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales, I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground in mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty. We saw no other occupied sites as we drove around looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a shortish walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in the Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright, almost luminous green, and very, very large. Some were as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended, first in tendrils close to the ground, then gradually rising around us as we went lower toward the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I had never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerged onto a small, foggy beach with the woods behind and above us. It felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention. Although I thought we were alone, I now noticed that there was a man several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently out over the water. My sister called out a friendly, "Hello." It was Newfoundland in the 80s. People did that sort of thing. But he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two, I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew, we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed, but I was tired, and my legs and feet felt like I'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and I had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking that we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure that she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in the direction she suggested and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there, worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for under 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us, while he had stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness was setting in, and our dad was worried that our mom hadn't returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst through the door, frantically saying that she'd run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her once. We'd all calmed down, we ate dinner, and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly tell my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning, and we never returned to that campground. This year, my partner needed to be admitted to the hospital for an infection with complications. The condition was called Ludwig's angina, and I was allowed to stay with him. We were there a total of 3 nights. Our hospital is quite old. Think that nasty greenish linoleum and the ceiling panels with the dots. I'm not sure the exact year that it was established, but I imagine it would be over 100 years old at this point. On the first night that we stayed, I was trying to fall asleep on a couple of chairs that I had pushed together, which was not very comfortable. I tossed and turned for a bit and then decided that I needed to get up and use the bathroom. Just before I actually got up, my head was rested on the wall beside me. Through the wall, I heard somebody softly calling out my name. Let me tell you, it scared the pee right back up there. I didn't fall asleep that night. I rather just passed out from exhaustion at a certain point. The next morning, my partner and I went for a walk to go and have a smoke. The hospital is smoke-free, so we had to walk a bit. Just around the corner from our room in the ward, there were 2 elevators. As we approached the lift, the doors popped open. We both kind of looked at each other with confusion. The light on the button had not been on, so I know that nobody called it. The doors remained open for a while before we hesitantly stepped in. I felt a presence with us next to the buttons. As I pressed the G button when I reached over to press it, there was a cooling sensation. I suppose it just could have been a draft. But either way, we went and had our smoke and came back to find the same elevator still open and waiting for us. We both half-joked about the kind ghost orderly who was helping us get around. Unrelated to the above stay, our hospital has always had weird stuff happening with all the lifts. For example, it will stop on floors that aren't requested, or it will go too fast or too slow. I suppose it could be easily explained away as mechanical stuff, but nobody's ever been able to find a problem, so I'm not so sure. Some of my good friends and I were going to hike in 5 miles on a Friday, fish an inaccessible section of the river for a state record, and hike out on Sunday. I say it's inaccessible because the whole river gets pushed into a canyon for 3 miles, and the only way you can fish it is to stay in the water, occasionally swimming between holes. Well, something happened, and they couldn't come down until Saturday morning. I hiked in, made sure the trail was marked well for them, set up camp in the afternoon, and took off for the river to catch supper. I fished a few holes below camp to catch supper and ended up catching 4 over 20 inches long. I cooked them up in a frying pan, one that I kept hidden back there, and the sky started clouding up. Long, black, rolling clouds with a touch of green. I double-checked my tarps, dug a shallow ditch around camp, made sure my tarp was hung well over the fire, and then it came. All of a sudden it was blowing sideways, but I didn't worry. I know how to build strong shelters. I broke out the bottle of bourbon that I rolled into the center of my bedroll, leaned back in my hammock, and watched it just pour down. The lightning was constant, and it started to crack all around me. I had a good view, as twilight was starting, of the tracks across the river. With a boom, I watched lightning strike the tracks and run right up the rails for 50 yards. I took a few long drinks out of the bottle and dozed off as the storm calmed down to a drizzle. In the dark, I awoke to the steady dripping of rain falling off the timber of a storm long since past. In the pitch black, the fire had died down to just a glow of hot coals, and I didn't set my lantern out in the rain. I dug in the pocket of my hammock for my flashlight. I had the sense to pull my pistol and my flashlight before I dozed off in my hammock. As I was rolling out of my hammock, I heard a sound in front of me within 15 yards, and then a squeal to my right and a growling kind of purr. I soon heard it all around me. The hair started to stand up on my neck as I couldn't place what kind of creatures made all those sounds or what could be that numerous. I sat real still, waiting on a moment for whatever it was to stop where I could spot it with my flashlight and my gun. I turned on my light and I saw eyes through the sights of my gun. Eyes about half a foot sitting on the moss, squalling. And I smiled in my buzzed, sleepy state. I had left the remainder of my fish sitting on the skillet on the rocks beside the fire, and a whole family of raccoons had sniffed them out. I took a few minutes to stoke the fire with some dry pine, took the skillet full of fish, and threw them just out of sight of the light of camp. With one loud cluck, the mama called all the little ones to eat. The fire kept them too scared to come any closer, but they must have been hungry. I dozed back off in the hammock. The next morning, I woke up and walked to where I had thrown the fish. They had cleaned up every fin, every bone, and every drop of grease, and had apparently moved on with full bellies. It definitely didn't end up being scary, but boy, it sure startled me before I knew what it was. A few friends of mine were into exploring abandoned places and checking locations out. Whether it's a rundown shack in the middle of nowhere or an abandoned building, we were always eager to take a look around. To be clear, we don't vandalize or destroy property. We just go take a look. One day, I find out that one of the cemeteries in my area is apparently haunted. It borders on an old abandoned mental hospital, and the cemetery was the burial ground for some of the unfortunates who died at that place. The asylum is 150 years old, and it was a horrible place for those who were housed there. All up, there were 4 of us. After 20 minutes of driving, we get out and search for this cemetery. After about 10 to 15 minutes of looking on maps and walking up and down the neighborhood, we finally came across the cemetery's entrance. It was around 11 p.m. when we got to the cemetery. It was very quiet, barely any cars on the street, and all I could hear was the distant dogs yapping about. All four of us start heading into the cemetery. We're taking this slow and using our eyes and ears to catch anything suspicious. As we're walking, I hear a faint laugh coming from the trees below. It sounded like a child. I first wrote it off as a dog barking in the distance or just something explainable. As we continue down the track farther, I hear the child laughter again. I turn to my friend, who turns to me, and we both just stare at each other. We both heard the same thing coming from the woods below and were just spooked. But that didn't stop us. We pushed on, going farther into the cemetery and toward the trees. We eventually ended up getting too scared and decided to turn around and walk back. I was positioned with another friend of mine about 2 meters behind my other buddies. All of a sudden, I can hear heavy footsteps walking toward us to our right. I'm not kidding when I say this. These footsteps just started picking up pace, and we could hear these loud, thumping steps just galloping at us. We panicked like crazy because we were looking directly toward this sound, and nobody was there. It was too loud to be some kind of critter, and it definitely wasn't another person. I'm older now, and I no longer explore urban places or abandoned places. It's too risky, and I don't want to get fined. But I still can't find the logical explanation for whatever it was that we experienced that night. This happened back in 2019, around November 2nd, if I remember correctly. This story is 100% true, although I'm still unsure if it was just a coincidence or what. But anyway, this is what happened. Back in 2019, I was pretty much depressed the whole year. I wasn't planning on doing anything. I just didn't care as much about my well-being. I stopped wearing a seatbelt. I didn't care if I lived or died. It wasn't that I wanted to do either. I just was apathetic. Due to this depression and things getting worse for me mentally at the time, I did a lot of really dumb things in the supernatural realm. I've always known not to speak to the dead, knowing that when you speak to one spirit, the rest can hear you as well. I've always been extremely superstitious, and I believe in the paranormal and supernatural 1,000%. Anyway, I live next to a huge cemetery, and I drive by it every day since it's right across from my neighborhood. Due to my superstitions and believing that the dead can do things us humans aren't quite capable of, each day I would scream out of the window when passing the cemetery, begging one of the spirits to, shall we say, bring me to their side. This habit started on November 2nd, I believe, so I did that each day while driving past the cemetery. Lo and behold, on November 6th, I was driving to work at about 4:30 in the morning. I go the same way every single day. I was coming up on a red light. Out of nowhere, and I kid you not, this was literally out of nowhere. I hear this loud honk from behind me, and I was rear-ended by one of those big white RG&E trucks, you know, the ones that fix telephone poles and stuff. Since I was at the red light, it basically pushed my car forward into the middle of the intersection, and once again, out of nowhere, I was T-boned by some random man in a van with his wife. I was driving an 005 Nissan Sentra at the time, and it was completely wrecked, literally demolished. But I had not one scratch on me at all. My knees were extremely bruised. I have no idea how that happened, but that was pretty much it. This also happened literally on the main road coming out of my neighborhood, about a mile down from the cemetery. And there are never cars this early in the morning, maybe one, but even that's rare. For the most part, while I was talking to the old man, they live in a town 40 minutes away, and they were driving to the park at 4:30 in the morning. The whole story is so weird, and it honestly kind of creeps me out, especially because one of the things I kept yelling was to get me in a car accident. It was an extremely bad financial situation for me at the time, and I was stuck without a car for quite some time. I think perhaps the cemetery or the spirits within it were maybe giving me what I asked for, but not what I asked for. Maybe they just wanted to wake me up and help me appreciate life again. Or maybe it was just a completely weird coincidence. Take it for what you will, but it was an extremely weird thing. I will never forget these two paranormal experiences that I had at church when I was 14. When I was 14, I went to a church gathering on Halloween night that was called Hallelujah Night. It was a Christian alternative to Halloween. My family and I would get there in the afternoon since we would volunteer to help set up the booths, cakewalk, candy barrels, etc. But I was mostly there to get first dibs on all the candy. After I finished helping with the usual booth setup, I took a seat on the bench near the main sanctuary. It was my favorite place to sit since I could see the entire lot, and most of all, the beautiful sunset. I pulled out my PSP and was just scrolling through some music that I had on it when some guy approached me and started a conversation. I've never been a people person, so usually when things like this happen, I keep the conversation short. However, this guy had this weird kind of warmth to him, as if he was a friend of mine. As the conversation carried on, I started to ask him if he was new because I hadn't seen him before. He told me that he'd been going to this church for years, but left after an incident happened. When I asked him about the incident, he paused, looked at me, and said that there were some things people pick up on that they know aren't normal, and that you should never get curious about things that you know you should leave alone. I sort of had a confused look on my face since I didn't know what he meant at the time. The guy noticed it and said that I would understand once I got older. I looked down at the PSP that I still had in my hands, and when I looked up right away, the guy was gone. I looked around and I couldn't find him anywhere in the lot. There were just a few people still prepping for Hallelujah night. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward to a few months later. I was sitting in the main sanctuary before leaving to do my usual volunteer work on the upper floor of the main sanctuary. The upper floor was a daycare area for kids, so at the end of service, volunteers would escort the children downstairs, and I would go into each room, shutting off the lights and making sure that no children were still up there. I'll never forget getting up to leave to do my usual duties when the pastor started talking about an upcoming funeral. I looked at the big screens on each side of the main sanctuary, and the face of the one man that I had been talking to during Hallelujah night setup was there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To this day, it still seems unreal. I was beyond shaken as I made my way out of the main sanctuary and to the flights of big stairs as I went up to the upper floor. Once I made it up to the upper floor, another volunteer had confirmed that all the children were escorted downstairs. She noticed that I had a sort of pale look from seeing what I had seen in the main sanctuary and asked me if I was okay. I told her that it was nothing, and I proceeded to cut off all the lights on the upper floor as she left downstairs. The upper floor was like a giant hallway with doors on each side and a door at the end of the hallway with a giant window in it. When I came to the last room at the end of the hall, I would always leave the blinds on that big window open, since the light always illuminated the dark hallway and made me feel less scared. But as I left the room, I remember feeling panicked. It started freezing, and I felt like if I left that room, something would be waiting for me in the darkened rooms that was going to jump out and attack me. As I'm trying to muster up the courage to just run for it, I see a small head of a child peek out a couple of doors down. It stayed there for a few seconds, then put its head back in the room. I immediately called out to the child but got no answer. The fear that I had had a minute ago was gone as I left the last room to go through the illuminated hallway. I made it to the other room in a matter of seconds, turning on the lights and searching the entire room for the child I saw, but no one was there. I started getting spooked again as I turned all the lights off in that room. As I was leaving the room, I looked back at the last room's window, which illuminated the hallway, and out of nowhere, a massive black mass moved in front of the window, almost covering the light completely. It was darker than dark, and its outline covered the light and seemed to be moving. It was enough to scare me to run for my life. I ran the rest of the hallway and down the stairs. I was stopped by one of the ushers, who told me not to run, but when I told him what I had seen, he looked at me like I was crazy. Once church was over, I told my parents about what happened on the ride home. They ended up not believing me, but I know what I saw that day. And the man who was apparently dead had warned me of something for a reason. Either way, those two events still scare me to this very day. So the other night, my boyfriend, daughter, who's 3.5, and I were walking in the cemetery a few blocks from our house. We drove because we wanted maximum walking time with the toddler. We planned to play Pokemon Go. We entered through the main entrance, and after a few steps, I started feeling nauseous and worried, anxious. I didn't know why, so I just ignored it. We wanted to check out the huge headstones toward the middle, so we headed that way. We noticed a car parked with its lights off, no front license plate, passenger and back doors wide open, and the man is halfway in the back seat. He's parked on one side of the big headstones, which ended up being for priests. We walked through and the guy noticed us. He closed the doors that were open, then went around to the driver's side and got in the car. He sat there and just watched us, so we veered away from him and went down a different path. My daughter all of a sudden says, "They're so loud." I said, "Who?" My daughter goes, "The rocks. They're talking to me." My mouth drops open. We didn't tell her anything about the cemetery or headstones or what the place even is. She has no idea what they are other than big rocks. We ended up leaving, and as soon as we drove away, my nausea eased up. I told my boyfriend about feeling sick, and he freaked out and explained EMF to me. Creepy. We went to the store and passed the cemetery on the way home again. The man's car was still there. He left after we pulled down the street that we lived on. We've had one other paranormal experience with her before. This was the second time that the afterlife, ghosts, spirits, something showed up to say that it exists, and it's confirmed for me. Later that night, she started talking about the rocks again and said that they were watching us. I asked her what they looked like, and she said, shadows. She said they looked like this, and then proceeded to make a worried expression. She told me that they couldn't walk with us and that they had to stay by the rocks. I don't know if the spirits were warning us about that man, or maybe there's just something not so good at that cemetery. But either way, it was a really interesting experience. Years ago, when my great-aunt passed, at her funeral, there was this old man. He was wearing a suit, and he had a neck tattoo of an octopus. He had long hair and a ponytail. He kind of looked a little bit like Jack from Breaking Bad. He started talking to me about my grandma and told me to take care of her and Grandpa for a few minutes. Then he gave me $1 and asked me nicely to go to the vending machine and get him a water because he came to pay his respects and he had to keep going. He even knew my name, but I had never met him before, and I hadn't given it to him. When I came back to give him the water bottle, I couldn't find him. I looked everywhere, and I even asked my grandparents if they had seen an older man around anywhere, and I described what he looked like. When we got home, my grandparents came over, and they were looking at family photo albums, and they saw the man that I described, the one that asked for a water, in the pictures. They yelled at me to come downstairs and showed me the picture and pointed to him. They asked if it was the man I had seen, and I said it was. He looked exactly the same. They told me that it was my great-aunt's ex-husband, Robert, who had been dead for 20 years. That's how he knew my name. He had died well before I was born, and like I said, I wasn't that close with my great-aunt, so I hadn't ever really heard about him. Either way, Robert had been dead for over 20 years. I didn't sleep for at least a week, maybe more. The faces they made still send shivers down my spine. It was like they were watching somebody get killed in front of them when they heard about what happened to me and realized who it had been. They told me he was a good person, and he and my great-aunt regularly attended church and were just overall good people. I would say that I'm kind of religious, but I don't know, so more than likely he wasn't up to anything evil, I guess. I suppose he asked for the water so I would go away and he could disappear. He really loved his wife, I guess. When he said he had to move on, it's because he had to take her to the next life or something. They asked me if I spent the $1, and I said I did. I kind of wonder what would have happened if I had kept it, or what happened to whoever wound up with it. Either way, it was a very unsettling and strange experience, if not kind of sweet. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to help restore a church that was over 100 years old. It had been vacant for roughly 45 years. The church is attached to what once was a primary school, which had already been restored into office spaces. This was a no-brainer since it was literally a couple of blocks away from my house under the table, and the responsibilities were incredibly easy. Since the church had been empty for years, we only worked during the day since the electrical system had yet to be installed. But during the days I would work, I would always see movement out of my peripheral vision, but nothing was there when I would look in that direction. This happened a lot, to the point where I had become accustomed to it. This all changed a few months later when the building became operational, as we converted the church to an event hall designed for any event you'd pay for. Well, after business hours one evening, I get a call from a tenant saying that something was making noise in the basement of the church. The power hadn't been installed to the basement at this point. I made sure to grab my brand new charged flashlight and keys to see what was happening. As soon as I got to the basement door, I could hear what sounded like power tools running. I go in and start making my way through a pitch-black labyrinth of a basement toward the noise. I find the cause of the noise, which was an air compressor. I know they bleed air at times, but I made sure that I bled all the air before I left earlier that day, and I unplugged it. I looked to see if somebody had plugged it in after me, but it was still unplugged. At this moment, my brand new flashlight starts to flicker, and another unplugged power tool turns on behind me. When I turned around to shine my fading light at it, the light went out completely. I got out of that basement so fast, through complete darkness toward the door. I get out and I see the tenant is standing at the door with a puzzled look on her face. She asks what was wrong as I'm out of breath and clearly freaked out. I tell her what happened, and she smirks and says that doesn't surprise her at all. She's lived in the neighborhood her entire life and tells me that as a child she attended the school and church. She then tells me a story of a woman who held the last wedding in the church before it shut down. It was a sad story because the woman was stood up on her wedding day and ultimately took her own life because of it. After that night in the basement, the paranormal activity happened more and more often. It got to the point where a coworker fell off a ladder. This ladder was always secured and he'd been up and down it 100 times. When I asked him what happened, he said that he felt like he was pushed. There were even times when the movement that I had always seen started to take shape. Instead of a blur, I started to see a person standing there, but still nothing there when I looked in that direction. What finally pushed me over the edge was the night I guess you can say I met her. Since events were always held there, I would always lock up afterwards. After an overnight booking, I ran into the guests as they were leaving. A gentleman asks me if there were any other people in the building that night. I said no, as we make sure the office part of the building is vacant during overnight bookings. He proceeded to tell me that he heard yelling from the basement and footsteps on the balcony. I assured him that they were the only ones there, and I began to lock up the building. As I'm locking the doors, I hear faintly what the gentleman was referencing. I could hear footsteps in the balcony, and I yelled out, "Is anyone still here?" I didn't get an answer, but at this point I was ready to go. What I hated most about locking up is the light switch is nowhere near the door, so you'd have to shut off the lights and then walk about 30 feet to the door in total darkness. I shut off the light and immediately sprinted toward the door. As I reach for the door, I hear footsteps behind me and a muffled voice say, "Leave." I didn't stop to see what it was. I made my way to the glass entry doors and to the other side as fast as I could. As I'm locking the door, I see movement inside the church. I look up and I see a ghostly or shadow-like figure standing where the altar once was. I quickly looked down to ensure that I had locked the door, and by the time I looked back up, the shadowy figure was now making its way to the glass doors. I honestly don't remember if I locked the door or not, because I immediately got out of there. After that night, I made sure that I never entered that building after dark again. Needless to say, I quit shortly thereafter. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a 45-mile, 3-night kayaking trip down the Green River in Kentucky, which runs above the Mammoth Cave System, the world's longest known cave system with more than 400 miles of surveyed passageways. We brought everything we needed in our kayaks and one canoe, food, tents, water filtration, etc., and camped each night on the riverbank when it started getting dark and we found level enough ground. Most of the time, the first night was uneventful, except to say that there is nothing like a wall of fireflies against a mountainous black tree line at night in the middle of nowhere. Beautiful. The second day, around sunset, after a long day of kayaking and baking in the July heat, we came upon a stream on the bank that opened up into a large ravine. The stream, as we found out, was a cave spring pouring out blue, freezing cold cave water into a lagoon about 30 feet wide and so deep that the blue water turned black after a few feet. The lagoon had a long, sandy beach secluded by hills on either side and a tall, overhanging cliff behind and above us. It was a beautiful, otherworldly place. Time moved very slowly there. We decided to camp there for the night. The sand was soft, white, and very fine, ideal for ground sleeping. For some reason, the place deeply frightened me, but I didn't speak up. We were all tired, and everyone was having fun. We built a small fire and enjoyed the stars through the leaf canopy for a while before everybody went to bed. I slept hard that night. At around 5 a.m., I woke up with an urge to relieve myself. It was still dark. Tent door zipper about halfway opened, and I had just popped my head out when I heard a loud and terrible roar or scream. I immediately cowered back into the tent and zipped it closed, and I waited. The scream came from about 10 feet to my left near the dwindling fire. It was high-pitched, not like an owl screech, although I'm not ruling that out. It was a wretched, pained scream that got lower-pitched toward the end. Being that we were in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, most likely it was a fox or a boar or some kind of bird. Whatever it was, I lay awake for an hour listening. I heard absolutely nothing. Granted, we were on a soft beach, but I didn't hear a single twig snap or leaf crinkle when whatever it was finally shuffled away. It was bizarre. I should mention at this time that up the beach and off to the side of the lagoon was a small dry cave opening, maybe 3 feet wide. I cannot say with any certainty that it was not some ancient cave-dwelling creature that surfaced to investigate our camp. I somehow fell back asleep and awoke the next morning, shaken. I asked if any of my friends had heard the terrible scream, but remarkably nobody had. We pressed on down the Green River. The third night, at dusk, we came upon a large, rocky beach. We pulled our boats ashore and decided that this would have to do, as we didn't want to go any farther downriver and risk being stuck on the water at dark. This rocky beach was where the river split in two, and in the middle formed a collection of pale rocks, tall grass, and dried-out wood, a desolate pile of muck the size of a football field. The landmass was covered in jumping sand spiders and tiny frogs, again otherworldly. We set up camp, ate, and all went to bed around the same time. It was silent for probably 20 or 30 minutes. I'm not sure. I was asleep, as the others most likely were as well. Suddenly, my dream was interrupted by what sounded like a booming, loud, mechanical wooden beast. I awoke and shot straight up. It was truly the loudest thing I have ever heard. It sounded like a massive bulldozer tearing down a huge steel and wood building. Then came a boom, followed by its echo throughout the river valley. The animal shifted and the birds flew away. We were all awoken by the crash and yelling in confusion to each other in our tents. Nothing but silence followed outside our tents, and nobody was particularly willing to shine a flashlight toward the woods. Eventually, we all decided it had to have been a falling tree, and we went back to sleep. The next morning, I thought about it some more. It didn't sound like just a falling tree. I must stress that it had a metallic quality and it was projected purposefully. It almost sounded like a roar. In the morning light, we found no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, nor any obvious fallen trees that could have made such a loud sound. So we packed up and headed out onto the river one last time to go home. My friends and I still talk about that trip and all the strange things that happened. We did the same kayak trip a couple of years later, and nothing out of the ordinary happened at all. No mysterious forest noises, to both my disappointment and relief. So I have a simple story for you. I always go to sleep with my bedroom door unlocked and the key for the door to one side on a shelf. Every time I have ever fallen asleep around people, they've said that I'm most quiet, that I'm almost a dead-looking sleeper because I move so little. To my knowledge, I have never sleepwalked. One day, I remember going to sleep as usual, door unlocked, key on the shelf. I woke up to my mom banging on my bedroom door, confused as to why it was locked. I found the key on the shelf and unlocked the door. I tried to explain that I hadn't locked it and I was just as confused as she was. It was very disorienting, and I think I probably looked like I was going crazy. It's something that I've wondered about a lot in my life. I don't think I'll ever get an answer as to how I woke up with my door locked from the inside when I was the only one in there. About 30 years ago, I spent several years working in movie theaters in Worcester, Massachusetts. My favorite was the huge old building that had been chopped up into 4 separate cinemas. It had been a beautiful theater back when it was built in 1926 as the Poli Palace, though it had been semi-destroyed during modernization in the late 50s. There were still many original features of the building that remained. As a manager, I had been issued a big keychain that gave me access to the entirety of the building, and I spent countless hours exploring nearly every part of that building, except the curtain loft, which would have required climbing an iron ladder up about 80 feet. No, thank you. The building had attics and basements and crawl spaces. There was an area in the front of the building on the second floor that had 2 or 3 abandoned businesses that had been walled off. There was a music store and a ballet studio and maybe an office. There was also a bathroom. Everything looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s. Faded wallpaper with a ballerina motif, a peeling mirror on the wall. In another section of the building was the old manager's office, with high ceilings and crown molding and a beautiful stained glass window that I believe dated back to 1912 and had previously been part of an adjacent theater. There was still an old safe in the office. I found a newspaper article in the public library from 1942 or 44 that detailed an armed robbery when 2 men had tied up the managers in the office and robbed the safe. One of those men was later executed in the electric chair for an unrelated crime. We used the old manager's office to store giant 30-gallon bags of popcorn. There was also a sort of crawl space under the box office that was accessible by lifting a hinged plywood panel and climbing over a 4-foot wall. On the other side were the remains of a couple of basement rooms with broken concrete and bricks strewn about. In one of those rooms, I found an old, flared Coca-Cola glass in perfect condition. I kept it for years. I also found a deck of cards in a handmade leather pouch with a snap closure fashioned out of a buffalo nickel. There were also old dressing rooms with makeup mirrors and light bulbs. The paint was peeling off the walls in potato chip-sized flakes. As you can surmise, the building was purported to be haunted. The head manager claimed to have had ghostly experiences, so I'll start there, I guess. When the building was remodeled in the late 1950s, the men's room in the basement was converted into the manager's office. One night, while closing up, the manager, my boss, made his way up the stairs to the main lobby. As he emerged, something caught his eye way up by the ornate 30-foot ceiling. He saw an apparition floating there. It disappeared into the ceiling. Terrified, he ran back down the stairs and hid in the office until daylight. Another time, he was again working late. There were several arcade machines in an area of the lobby, and they were normally powered off when the last shows were in. As he climbed the stairs, he heard all of the machines making their electronic bleeps and bloops. He was annoyed that the usher had clearly failed to turn off the machines before punching out and realized that he would have to go do it himself. As soon as he opened the door, though, the noises stopped dead. Looking across the lobby from where he emerged, the machines were all dark. They were indeed powered off. A projectionist claimed that he looked out of the booth window one night in the big theater upstairs while shutting things down and saw a face looking in at him. I take those stories with a grain of salt. I was always skeptical of those, based on the sources. But here's my experience. I was obsessed with the history of the building and would research newspaper archives for articles about it. There were rumors that a stagehand had died there in an accident during the time that it had been a vaudeville theater. I was never able to confirm that. I had talked about the building to my mother, and she in turn happened to discuss it with a woman that she worked with. The woman claimed to be a psychic or clairvoyant, or maybe just that she would get feelings about things. She told my mother that she had been to that theater and that she felt that somebody had indeed been killed there and that his name began with the letter M. My reaction was, okay, sure, she sounds nutty. Sometime later, I was the sole manager on duty on a slow night, midweek. I was alone in the office in the basement. The 7 o'clock shows were in and I was doing paperwork. The intercom buzzed. It was the box office cashier calling to tell me that I had a phone call. I asked who it was, and she said that she didn't know. I hung up the intercom and pushed the button for the main incoming line where the call was holding. The earpiece erupted with a loud, close squealing and static. I used the word close because it was so loud and distinct that I assumed that it was something wrong with the phone PBX in our building rather than the line itself or the caller's phone. It was just the impression I had. Hello? Nothing. Just more squealing and static. Hello? I repeated. Hello? A man's voice, calm, flat, distinct. Then nothing further. Who is this? I was a bit perplexed. All of the noise on the line and the caller seemingly reluctant to speak. This is Mike. Calm, quiet, not shouting over the noise of the line like he couldn't even hear it. Quite audible and clear. Then nothing but the awful squealing and static. I waited a few seconds for the caller to continue. After all, he called me. Presumably there was a reason, but nothing. Mike who? I said, feeling a little bit impatient. Mike is a common name, and there were 2 Mikes employed there at the time. One of them had a fairly high-pitched voice that sounded nothing like the caller. It didn't sound like the other Mike either. The line abruptly went dead silent. The squealing and hissing stopped. I waited. Nobody called back. I called Sandy, the box office cashier, and asked her if they had asked for me personally or just to speak to the manager. She said that the caller had asked for me by name, and suddenly I remembered my mother's friend. A man's name beginning with the letter M. Mike. It never happened again, and the phone never made those noises again. No one ever confessed to some kind of a prank, and I never figured out who it was. As a young man, I loved to climb mountains. This is an amazing encounter that occurred to me on one climbing expedition. We had left a hut late one night. The intention was to summit a mountain in a single long push by climbing right through the night. It was bad weather in the middle of winter, and there was deep snow. We were trying to find our way through a maze of crevasses on a glacier. I remember the howling winds and clouds moving rapidly through the sky as the bulk of the mountain loomed over us. There was a full moon, which would hide behind the clouds before emerging again. I remember seeing a man moving up the slope from below us. The first thing that struck me was that he didn't have a headlamp on. I yelled over the wind at my climbing partner, "Let's go talk to this guy!" "What guy?" he shouted back. "That guy," I said, pointing down at the figure moving toward us. There was a pause. "What guy?" At this point, I remember losing it. "That freaking guy right there." "He's right there!" And at that point, I looked back down to see absolutely nothing. He had fallen into a crevasse. We walked down, but we never found any tracks. There was no trace of anyone. In the years since, I have heard reports of similar encounters in that area. In fact, recently, the bones of a deceased climber from the 1970s were discovered, melted out of the ice. The news report reminded me of my mysterious climber from that night, and it just makes me wonder. In Southeast Asian culture, there's a particular ghost or demon that has its head detached from its body. It floats around with the intestines floating around below it, and apparently it glows. If you're Cambodian, you would know it by the name of Arb or Ap. I believe in Thai. It's called Krasu. You can Google it and get a good picture. Anyway, during high school, I was hanging out with a group of my friends who were all Southeast Asians. We were hanging out really late into the night, probably about 1 or 2 a.m., just drinking and overall just talking about random crap in the parking lot of an apartment complex. One of the guys, a real tough dude that was physically bigger than us and never afraid to throw it down against others, had to go relieve himself. He went to the side of the apartments where there were no lights. After a minute or so, we just heard this loud yell of, "Oh, dude!" He literally ran back to us with his pants still unbuttoned and unzipped, with his pants covered in urine. The look on his face was one of sheer terror. We asked him what had happened, and he told us that he saw an app floating around. Feeling pretty uneasy about the whole thing, the other guys pulled out their guns. We waited for not even 3 minutes before finally just heading back home. When the older folks in the complex heard about it, they mentioned that one of the residents was practicing some kind of black magic and that maybe she had conjured it, but no one's ever really done anything about it. I mean, what can they do, right? Everybody suspected this girl, but no one really knows. The weird thing, though, is that she died later and nobody ever knew why. I have had many paranormal, seemingly extraterrestrial, glitch in the matrix, and skinwalker experiences. I think one too many for one person to have. The one I'm going to tell you about freaks me out to this day. There is quite a bit of detail to this story, so I will try to make it as coherent as possible. The time was 2011, my final year of high school. Now I am a Navajo from a small reservation in New Mexico, and the nearest city is 30 miles west. I attended a public school in that city. Therefore, I had to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning to catch the bus at 6, which picked up more kids along the way, and we would arrive with just enough time to get breakfast before class at 7:25. This particular morning seemed normal. My alarm went off at 5. I showered, fixed my hair, and was ready by 5:40. I would usually give myself 10 to 15 minutes to make some breakfast and pack my lunch. I did just that and decided to have Pop-Tarts that morning. I checked the time on the stove clock, and it was 5:50. I popped the tarts into the toaster and went to my room to gather my things into my backpack. As I was finished with that, I saw that my alarm clock read 5:55, and I went to grab my Pop-Tarts. The stove clock read 5:56. We had a big clock right by our front door, and it also read 5:56. I checked the time often so that I could perfectly time my walk to the bus, so that it showed up just as I arrived at my bus stop. Additionally, it was a winter morning and it was dark out. The sun didn't start to come up until about 7, and I didn't want to be stuck in the cold dark for too long. Normally, when I stepped outside, there would be cars driving about, neighbors who turned on their vehicles to warm them up from a frigid winter night. But that morning, there was nobody, and that was a bit strange to me, but I didn't pay that fact any mind. Now, since it's the reservation, aka the middle of nowhere, where I lived, there wasn't much light either. Few residents had streetlights. In the cluster of homes where I lived, unfortunately, the route that I walked every day had no streetlights. So the only lights I could see in the near pitch black were the ones at my back from our porch light. In the north, a neighbor's porch light who lived 3 acres away in the southern direction, and the far-off lights of the city that lit the sky in the east. There were also the lights from the reservation clinic, which was about a mile south as well. I should also let you know that each home in our cluster of homes is set on an acre lot. My bus stop was 2 acres away. I would walk directly south to meet up with the only paved road, the highway, which met the dirt road in the east from my home. To that stop, it only took me a minute or two. When I stepped outside, nothing was astir, which, like I said, was really odd. However, I wasn't out there alone because although it was almost pitch black, I saw the silhouette of a girl who caught the bus at the same time as I did and at the same stop. Good, I thought. I'm not out here alone. I followed about 10 feet behind her. When we neared the stop, she veered off to the cattle guard where she always sat to wait for the bus. I always sat on the porch steps of my uncle's house when the bus hadn't arrived yet, which was only about 5 to 10 yards from the bus stop. When I sat on those steps, I started to notice more and more things that were out of place. One of those was the fact that my uncle, an early riser who was always awake by 5, who always had his lights on by the time I was catching the bus, was not awake. He wasn't out having his morning coffee as usual. No lights, no sounds from inside his house. Maybe he's sleeping in today, I thought. Then the neighbor, whose home was 3 acres away from mine, my uncle's next-door neighbor whose porch light was on, would normally have had their vehicle running, warming up by now, and their lights would be on, showing that somebody was awake and probably getting ready for work. But there were no signs of anybody being awake at all, and the truck wasn't on. Well, maybe they have the day off, I thought. Still waiting for the bus, the other girl's silhouette I could see from the city lights that lit the sky to the east, and she was still sitting there and waiting as well. I was a little bit unsettled, but I didn't start to feel really creeped out until I started to hear the howls and yelps from what sounded to be a pack of coyotes that seemed to be only across the main highway. Since I didn't have a cell phone at the time, I had guessed that I was waiting for about 10 minutes. Finally, I thought, okay, this is ridiculous. Where is the bus? It should have been here by now. I was on time, and it was very unlike the bus or the bus driver to pick us up more than 5 minutes late. I decided to wake up my uncle and ask if maybe we had missed the bus. So I knocked on his door for a good 3 minutes to no avail. Then I just decided to walk over and ask the girl if she wanted to walk back to our homes together, since I was sufficiently weirded out by the events. As I neared her and where she sat, my eyesight adjusted in the darkness, and when I was within arm's reach, I saw that there was nobody there. I thought I was going crazy. My mind raced and I felt panic and queasy in the pit of my stomach. All the creepy skinwalker and paranormal stories that I had heard over the years began to run amok in my mind. But what remains from those stories was that I was always told to never fear any of it. You should never be afraid of the evil things that lurk in the darkness, because your fear is their fuel. I decided not to panic and run home. Instead, I just walked briskly back home, still able to hear the whoops and calls from the nearby pack of coyotes and trying to figure out what was going on. When I got inside, I went to my mom's room and asked to use her cell phone. Just as she was about to hand me her cell, she took a second glance at the screen and said, "It's 4 in the morning. What do you need my phone for?" Shock took hold of my body, and all I could do was stand there with my mouth wide open as she trailed her remark with, "Are you awake? Have you been sleepwalking?" I have never sleepwalked in my entire life, and my reply felt forced, like I had to convince her that I was awake. I ran back to the kitchen. The clock read 4 a.m. The clock by the front door read 4 a.m., and the alarm clock in my room read 4 a.m. I don't know anything about any of these types of sleep disorders, but I seriously think that there's no way for me to have gone through with my usual routine the way that I did, asleep. Needless to say, I was sufficiently freaked out and crawled back into bed. So freaked out, I didn't even take my shoes off. I fell asleep thinking of the whole situation, and ironically, I missed the bus that day. I told my third oldest sister, there are 4 of us and I'm the youngest, about what had happened. She was a little shocked at what she was hearing, and then she began to tell me of a dream she had before my experience. Now, her dreams we have begun to revere as visions of sorts, since she's had many of them end up coming true. Her earliest one I remember was when we were in elementary school and my dad called and said that earlier in the day he was in a small airplane and that they nearly crashed into the mountains near San Carlos, Arizona. She told us about a dream about being in an airplane in a heavily forested area, that the plane was about to crash but was able to land safely, a few days before we got that call from our dad. Since then, she's had others. Some she tells us about, others she doesn't. Before I tell you about the dream, I must also tell you about a weird incident that happened to said sister at my eldest sister's house. This particular incident happened the summer preceding the winter I had my weird experience. My sister, the dream visionary, would stay over at my eldest sister's house to help babysit my nephews. They would stay up very late, and one night or morning, because it was around 2 a.m., they heard a sort of banging in the back of the house. My sister and the nephew went out to check. When they opened the door, they saw 2 horses, one white and one brown, kicking with their hooves and hitting their heads against the big garbage bins, which were knocking into the house. It was as if they were trying to get in, but for what? We had no clue. To add to that weirdness, my sister's house is in a housing development that has 2 entrances, and since it's on the reservation, those entrances have cattle guards. So how could those 2 horses have gotten in? Anyway, they chased the horses out of the yard, and they galloped off to who knows where. Anyway, back to her dream.